Hello everyone! Happy to see you all today at this event, and while I really hope that this conference is going to be offline this year, unfortunately for us all, I'm speaking with you remotely again from Amsterdam. Maybe next year? Let's hope for it. And today we're going to talk about a topic that is an endless source of frustration for all the developers, which is handling a local state of our application in the cases when it needs to deal with asynchronous behavior, API requests, and all like this. And let me quickly reintroduce myself. My name is NATALIA TEPLUHINA. I'm Vue.js core team member. I work mostly on Vue documentation, so if you were reading Vue 3 docs, there are high chances that you were reading something that I authored. I work as a staff frontend engineer at GitLab, and there at GitLab, of course, we have Vue in our frontend stack. But for state managers, we deal both with Vuex, that will be briefly touched in this talk, and Apollo client, that will be briefly touched in this talk as well. So I know the pains of each solution, and I have some idea about what I'm talking in this particular talk. And I'm also Google Dev expert in web technologies. So let's start diving into our global state. So what is global state in our application? This is some data that we want to share across different components, different views, different routes, and for some reason we need it available everywhere in our application. Let's look at a very short, brief, quick example for those who never worked with Vuex or forgot how it looks like, and this will be Vuex 4. So if syntax is a bit unfamiliar to you, don't be afraid. It's very similar to Vuex 3 that we use with Vue 2. So imagine that we have a local state that returns one single property called count, and this is 0. And we need to change this property somehow, so we add a mutation because all the state properties should be only changed with mutations. So we have a mutation for incrementing the count. That just increments the count, like suggesting by name. And this is already enough to use this in our component, but some companies, like my own one, has a convention that says that we cannot commit mutations from components. If you ever heard this is an anti-pattern, this is incorrect. You can call mutations, commit mutations from components, but it may make your factoring harder when you need asynchronous behavior. That's why sometimes we wrap them in actions. So this is sufficient boilerplate for incrementing count. What we are dealing with here in this particular example. First of all, we deal with asynchronous changes in the state. That's why I said that probably we won't even need an action. And we don't have any asynchronous behavior here. It's non-persistent, so whenever I update the page, count will be 0 again. We don't need to store this anywhere else outside of the Vuex state. Has one source of changes, so this is like our magical single source of truth that only is responsible for changes of count in our application. Count can be changed anywhere else. It's stored only in Vuex and changed only in Vuex. And yes, it does not create a lot of boilerplate. This point can be a bit debatable because like 3 different properties for changing one count, still, it's a reasonable amount of boilerplate for this change, considering the fact that count will be shared all across the application. But all of this is not as nice when we start dealing with the server data. So let's add some server data to the equation in our Vuex state. Here, at the first look, it looks like the same count. We have a property characters, and we have a mutation that changes characters, and we have some asynchronous section that fetches data from our characters endpoint. And after this, we commit a mutation, so everything is fine. But with this, your application is not sufficient because fetching characters is an asynchronous operation, which means that there will be a moment in your app when there are no characters and you're idle. You're waiting for your API to return your data. And of course, you add loading state because you need to show this nice loading spinner or skeleton or whatever you're showing in your application. And also, we are fetching data from the API. And what if response is not there? What if request wasn't successful? We need to handle errors, which is a super good practice for any asynchronous call. And that's why we need to add one more flag, error, to our application. And with this, our simple structure of one action, one mutation becomes not as simple, because you need to update loading, you need to update error. And here is quite a common convention, GitLab uses it as well, to handle asynchronous behavior with requests. So here we have like 3 finite states: a loading state, a success state, and an error state. And here we are setting loading to true, error to false, so we are in a loading state now. Then we receive our characters. If everything is fine, loading is false, error is null, characters are here, and we render the array of characters. And of course, there can be some error state. So in this particular case, we set loading to false. We say that error is something that server returns to us. Characters like 3 mutations. Yes, you can simplify it if you have the only one, but if you want some kind of standard, usually companies come with something like this. And now our action is not as simple as well, because when we start an action, we go into this loading limbo state, requesting characters, and then we will have characters. We commit the success mutation, storing the characters to the state. And if there is an error, we also commit an error mutation. And if you imagine all of this boilerplate, it's quite big already. So it's huge for one single request. And if we have multiple requests, probably we have different loading states. Or should it be the same loading state? Every single time you do this, you need to rethink it and to understand if we want to share loading states between different requests in our application. And this still doesn't answer a bunch of questions. How to fetch only when data is not in Vuex? I heard this request like 50 times probably. How to write a getter that will return me my data if data is in Vuex, and will dispatch an action if data is not in Vuex. There is no such getter. Getter is only getter. We don't want to commit a side effect. That's why every single time we need to implement this behavior in our application, we come with the same set of wheels. We do this check in the component. Okay, if this in this state, I'm not going to dispatch an action. Or we dispatch an action, then action checks the state, like, okay, we are calling Axios, or we just return, because we already have data in our component. And this is a bit annoying because you need to re-implement this for such a common case in your app. Second one is how to keep my data up to date. Because in this particular case, we're still thinking about Vuex as a single source of truth, but it's not, because your source of truth is on the API. And your Vuex right now is only a reflection of the server. I call it a server cache, server data, server state. This state belongs to the server, and we try just to have this reflection on our front end. And we need to keep this reflection up to date. If you're lucky, you have WebSockets. So on a WebSocket event, you update your Vuex state. For those of us who cannot allow themselves WebSockets, we do polling. Every 30 seconds, we send this request to the server, triggering all these changes of actions, mutations, loading state, handling errors, and then we update something in Vuex. Well, that's sometimes challenging. And then, what if two components start fetching the same query simultaneously? Nothing will explode, honestly, but you will have 2 requests, because Vuex has no built-in behavior for deduplicating requests. They will be both resolved, action will be triggered twice. Why it's all happening? Why we have so many problems with asynchronous behavior in Vuex? Because we are dealing not with a local state anymore. We are dealing with something different, something that first of all is asynchronous, and we need to deal with all the bells and whistles of asynchronous behavior, so loading state, error states, and all these like different finite states in our application depending on this behavior, something that is persisted remotely, something that has a source of truth outside of our control as a front-end developer. And that's why it has shared ownership. Our database on the server can be updated from somewhere else. It can be updated by a backend developer, but it can be also updated from the other instance of our front-end client. And we need to deal with this behavior. We need to reflect changes to server to changes to client. And unfortunately for us, Vuex is not designed with this in mind, like Redux wasn't designed with this in mind for React. This is not specifically a Vuex issue. This is an issue for most of the state managers. Not all states are born equal. It's good to think about what we consider a global state, something that is separated to our local state. So the synchronous data that are persisting only in applications, something like form data when you're filling the form, and server cache, something that is present on the remote API. And you can say, what are alternatives to this? Well, let's first consider this quick example of Vuex in the application that I built. Now, let's do this. So I have an application running. Let me quickly check on what particular address we are going. So starting the task. Yep, 3001. Here we go. And I like Dune. I like the recent movie, so I built a fake API just reflecting a few of Dune characters. And what we have here, we are fetching the array of characters on our main page. Here it goes. And when I go to sum of the root, I fetch one more character. What is happening in the application in this particular moment? First of all the characters are stored in Vuex. So here goes my app. And let's check our store. So you can see I have characters, loading, and error flags. We're all set. And we have this set of mutations. I was trying to abstract this as much as possible. I have the same loading state for character and characters and error state as well. So that's why I have this like two set loading and set error state, set characters, and set character, which is my favorite part. Because here we are selecting a character from the characters array by index. And then we enrich the data. Because what happens here? Let's go to our characters page and see. So our characters here is an array of things that only contains normally an ID, a name for every single character. And when I go to this root, I have a bunch of data like description, faction, when a character was born. And when I go back, I have like Paul and Chenny, we check them both in the application. They are enriched by the character call. And this is super fragile because what I'm doing in my character view is I check, and this is super funny by the way, I need to check if character already has a description, because if it does, I don't want to call an action for fetching character, exactly what I was explaining. So I'm checking if description is there, and if it's not, I dispatch fetch character and show the character in my API. But I'm relying on the fact that characters array is already fetched. So I believe that this request is resolved faster than my character. And so far it works just fine in my application. So if I go to Paul, and you can see that characters is resolved faster than the single character. But I can imagine the case when characters fetches thousands of records. And what if it's resolved after? I cannot rely on this. This is a synchronous behavior. I built something super, super fragile on my front-end part. And also, look at this. When I'm fetching Paul, I always fetch this character list first. I don't even need it. I need only Paul Atreides. Why I'm fetching all that? Because my tool is not perfect. What are alternatives to this? Well, if you work with GraphQL, you probably know Apollo Client, and I already mentioned it during this talk. Apollo Client is amazing if you work with GraphQL, And if you use it with Vue 3, the syntax will look something like this. You have a use query from your Apollo composable. And whenever you call the API, because this will trigger an API call, our GraphQL API, you have result, loading, and error, and many more properties, but so far we need only these. And I can display them in my component. The best part, and this query stores the response to cache. So whenever I call it again from this component or any other component, by default, it will first hit the cache. And then, if cache is empty or something, it will call an API. This behavior can be changed in Apollo client settings, but by default, everything is in cache. It's cached first. If you wonder what is characters query GQL if you never worked with GraphQL, this is just a GraphQL query. An Apollo client is technically capable of working with REST API. You can create a resolver, so whenever you call a characters query, instead you're just doing the call for your REST API with Axios and return something that is shaped properly for our query, which is still valid, but it's a bit of boilerplate. And then you can also have your local state in Apollo client. So imagine if you want to add character, you would need to do all of this. You will read the query from the cache, create a new character, create a new data object, and you, because Apollo cache is immutable, and then you write query down back to the cache. It's fine if your application doesn't have a rich local state. If it's something super server cache based, and you need only to fetch data from the server and update them with mutations. With a local state, it's questionable. The boilerplate here is probably bigger than in Vuex, and your developers are most likely to complain about Vuex was better. The problem here is the one size doesn't fit all. We have a Vuex, which is super nice in handling local state and is kind of problematic with dealing with server, as you can see in this talk. But we also have Apollo client, which is great when you work with server, mostly with GraphQL API. And it's a bit more questionable when you need to deal with a local state. So maybe our desire to have single source of truth is not as great. Maybe we handle two different entities, and it would be nice to have two different tools. So if we leave Vuex for the local state, there is a great tool. For React, it exists for a longer time. It's called React Query by Tanner Linsley. But for Vue, it was created recently because Tanner exposed the core of React Query, and there was a Vue Query wrapper created by Damian Osipuk. And I want to have a little demo of this tool right now in my talk. So I will remove this, and switch to the initial branch. And let's use Vue Query here. So in our home view, we will import the method called useQuery from our Vue Query library. And we also will need our getCharacters method. So I will import getCharacters from API.js, and this is just an Axios call to my local host. So here I will start using my use query. First, I want to return some data from use query, and here first argument is a key for the query, characters, and second is my fetcher function, get characters. Let's return data from the setup and see how it looks like in our application. Here are my dev tools. I go to the characters, and data is an object that contains a data array of 10 characters. So with this, I can use the magic of the computed and say that const characters, oh, it's already here. Const characters is a computed property based on data value, because this is a ref, please always remember to use value with refs data. And here goes my list of characters. I can remove returning data here now. And also, I can expose is loading and is error here in my app, instead of creating these two refs. And right now, there is a super short moment when you can see loading here, blinking. And if I make a mistake in my API, interesting moment, it will be a few retries that Vue query does by default. And after this, it will say, okay, there is an error right here on the page. I really like the idea about retries, because mostly when there are issues with connectivity, we want some kind of a retry. And this is basically it for the characters page. Let's go to the character single one and do kind of the same. I want to import get character here. And I'm going to copy paste the call and modify it slightly. Because for the character, we will need to pass an additional parameter to get character, an ID. That's why I will also don't need is error here. The syntax slightly changes. First argument is an array now, where I pass props ID, and this comes from the router. And second will be a callback, where I call get character. Oops, it was unexpected, with this props ID parameter. Here we go. And I will copy paste my data value data from here. This is API, and I will replace character. So my character is this, and I don't need as loading anymore. My character is computed based on data value data, and I click here. What happened? Oh, I forgot to import it computed. Here we go, and here is Polo Traders. And now the interesting moment. I go to characters, characters are fetched. I go to poll, poll is not fetched. Characters, poll, characters, poll, because the data right now is in Vue query cache. But here goes cool thing. I have a defined stale time, which means that all my queries will be stale after the 20 seconds. So 20 seconds, we're hitting the cache. After 20 seconds, they are all invalidated and removed from the cache, and then I will have an API call. So right now, when I go to characters, I have a characters request, and when I go to poll, here goes poll request. Of course, this is like super small part of what our Vue query can actually handle, but I hope it was an interesting moment to look at, and I hope you will dive a bit into this library and give it a try. Thank you all for attending the talk. Bye.